It often takes a minute or so to even get up into the Facebook, so.
It says live at the moment.
Sometimes you have to refresh and, oh, there we are, okay. What I don't want is to see me though. Hang on a sec. Should be seeing you.
So you say this, it's seeing me, I mean, seeing you rather than me.
Now it's you, Rick. So just,
Okay.
I'll give you a countdown. Okay, we'll be starting book.
And we are at 7 o'clock. Ready to go live? Well, welcome to another edition of Book Bites, a program highlighting books published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Tonight's book bite is about the Great War at Home. I am Rick Pifer, author of The Great War Comes to Wisconsin. I'm going to talk a bit about how this book came to be written, why I study wartime society, and the importance of World War I. If you find this edition of Book Bites interesting, please consider buying a copy or giving it to a friend. You can also ask if your public library has a copy of The Great War Comes to Wisconsin. It is, by all accounts, a good read. And you need not take my word for it. The Great War Comes to Wisconsin won a silver medal in 2017 from the Independent Publishers Association as one of the best works of nonfiction in the Midwest that year. It also won kudos from the Wisconsin Historical Society itself in 2018 as one of the best works of Wisconsin history. But my favorite story about a reader enjoying the book comes from an old friend who was reading The Great War on a shuttle bus in the Las Vegas airport going to get a car. At one stop, the gentleman sitting next to him got up to leave the shuttle. As he did so, he turned to my friend, pointed to the book and said, "Great book," and then left the shuttle. We have no idea who this individual was, but if you're listening tonight, thank you very much. I've been interested in the impact of the war on American society for as long as I can remember. It is my firm belief that studying a society under stress gives us a window into that society. I choose to write about Wisconsin during World War I because that war placed unique stresses on society and fractured many ties that helped bind society together. Today, we have lost a sense of the importance of the Great War. The veterans of that war are now gone, and the memory of what they did has been eclipsed by the Second World War. Nonetheless, First World War offers many important lessons useful in our own time. The war fostered a wave of repression unheard of before or since. It demonstrated just how fragile civil society can be. Frankly, it stands as a stark warning of how dangerous, hate-filled, politically charged rhetoric can be. So I study World War I because it is a window on ourselves. The Great War Comes to Wisconsin is a social history of the home front. It's a political history of the struggle between progressives and free speech on the one hand, and super patriotic authoritarian control over society on the other. Finally, it is a military history about the 32nd Division. I don't believe you can really understand wartime society without considering all of these pieces together. When the war began, experts estimated that it would last a few months. By Christmas 1914, instead of being over, each side had built a line of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. For the next 2 years, the two sides pounded away at each other, killing or wounding millions of soldiers. The Battle of Verdun lasted a year and cost the Germans and French over 1 million casualties. The Battle of the Somme, also in 1916, between the British and the Germans, lasted almost 5 months and cost the combatants over 1 million men killed, wounded, or captured. These horrific battles barely moved the front line. Here at home in the United States, horrified by the slaughter in France, Woodrow Wilson urged the American people to be neutral in fact as well as name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as action, must put a curb on our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party over the other. This was a noble sentiment born out of the desire to stay out of the conflict. It was also hopelessly impractical and unrealistic, not the least of which because United States bankers became the financiers of the Allied cause. So although the government may have tried to be neutral and the people may have tried to be neutral, banks were not necessarily so. Gradually, the president and the nation drifted towards support of the Allies. By January 1917, Wilson was convinced that Germany represented a threat to democracy, and he reluctantly guided the nation into war. In his address to Congress, asking for a declaration of war, Wilson said, "The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. It is a war against all nations. We must put excited feeling away. Our motive will not be revenge or the victorious assertion of physical might, but only the vindication of right, of which we are only a single champion." So he set the United States on a course for war. Congress debated at great length and ultimately overwhelmingly voted to declare war. But 50 members of the House of Representatives declined to go to war, voted for peace. 20% of those negative votes, virtually the entire Wisconsin congressional delegation, voted against the war. Likewise, one of our two senators, Robert La Follette, voted against war. There remained great ambivalence in Wisconsin because of the progressive traditions that still held great power, and the fact that 38% of our population could claim direct Germanic heritage through at least one parent. This was a state that did not want to go to war, and the congressmen voted the will of their constituents. Congressman John Esch from La Crosse reflected the reluctance to go to war when he wrote to his wife, Anna, just 2 days after the declaration. He wrote, "My dearest Anna, well, if you get the papers of Thursday, you will see that I, with 49 others, voted against war. I listened to 17 hours of the 18 hours of debate and weighed every argument and circumstance and concluded we should not declare war. I expect to be criticized and branded as a coward, etc. But the future will judge and judge rightly. When the boys are being conscripted and sent to the trenches of Europe to fight the battles of other nations, our people will begin to question the wisdom of the course taken. But now that we are at war, it is the duty of every loyal citizen to stand by his government and its flag without faltering or delay." So overnight, the mood of the country shifted as people fell into line with patriotic fervor behind the war effort. All too soon, American troops were boarding troop trains. The first to go were the National Guard. The National Guard of Wisconsin, along with the National Guard of Michigan, became the core of the 32nd Division. And very readily in 1917, they were called to action all across the state. National Guard units were feted with parades and patriotic music and flags flying. Dignitaries heralded the sacred duty and heroic spirit of the troops. Soldiers hugged loved ones, friends and family, shed tears, and bid the men farewell. Train whistles blew. Young men, soon to be soldiers, leaned out of the windows to wave goodbye, and then they were gone. In the hearts of well-wishers resided pride for the men who had volunteered to serve their nation, and perhaps also a sense of foreboding, born of the certain knowledge that some of these young men would not come home. Patriotism fueled this self-sacrifice in the name of God and country. It motivated young men on the battlefield and civilians who volunteered for war work. But in the wrong hands, patriotism motivated attacks on those who were culturally different or who disagreed with the government policy. Patriotism had many manifestations. In cities and towns across Wisconsin, patriotic rallies and parades provided a mechanism through which individuals could collectively express their loyalty and unity as a community. These public affirmations of faith in the nation caught the headlines. But most expressions of patriotism went unheralded by public notice because they were small, personal actions. Soon, the draft provided one of the earliest opportunities for Wisconsin to show its colors. Oddly enough, fearing riots by the state's German population, remembering the draft riots of the Civil War, Army officials in Washington offered to send federal troops to maintain order in Wisconsin on draft registration day, June 5th, 1917. Governor Emanuel Phillips replied with a polite, "No, thank you." He had full faith in the people of Wisconsin, and without fuss or fanfare, 218,000 men registered for the draft. 106% of the number estimated as eligible. All too soon, the troop trains began leaving, and ultimately approximately 118,000 young men from Wisconsin, 5% of the population, served in the armed forces. 8,000 of them became casualties. 1,800 died. And the 32nd Division suffered the third highest casualties of any American division. On the home front, Uncle Sam relied on the same dedication of average Americans to win the war on the farm, in the factory, and as volunteer war workers. Farmers quickly adapted to the needs of the war effort. The United States became the Allied breadbasket. Food shortages in Europe made wheat a golden commodity, easy to preserve, easy to ship. Wheat from the Great Plains fed the Allied nations. In states like Wisconsin, which did not grow much wheat, farmers quickly turned to growing foodstuffs that could replace wheat on the domestic table. By 1918, Wisconsin farmers had brought approximately 94,000 additional acres under cultivation. Production of corn, potatoes, oats, and barley had increased by between 10 and 15% over pre-war output. Farms, just like factories, were dedicated to winning the war. And along with the production of food, the United States Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover, began a conservation program that relied on volunteer housewives to make it work. Hoover came up with the brilliant idea of a pledge that housewives could take to conserve food, to eat wheatless or meatless days, and as a consequence, to make daily sacrifices in the name of the war effort, which not only preserved food for consumption, but was a way to express one's own patriotism. The food campaign touched everyone. Women across the nation signed the Herbert Hoover Food Pledge. Now, just a little sidelight, if you happen to go to a restaurant in this time and it was a meatless day, you would probably today be a little surprised because you'd find chicken and fish on the menu. Why? Because they're not meat. Pork, beef, lamb are meat. High participation resulted from patriotic fervor, but also from a type of social pressure seldom seen in America. To illustrate that pressure, there's a story that comes out of Dane County. The Dane County Defense Council was concerned that not a high enough percentage of housewives had signed the Hoover Pledge. And so they initiated a campaign, a month-long campaign, to get housewives to sign up. On November 18th, the final day of the drive, promoters of the pledge went door to door in a manner that made it difficult for housewives to turn them down. Phoebe Eyre, organizer of the drive, reported triumphantly that they added 10,448 pledges that day. They achieved this result through hard work and concerted effort. Eyre told the Wisconsin Council of Defense, quote, "The last day of the drive, we arranged an automobile parade that went through every street in Madison. And at every house where the food pledge card was not to be seen in the window, an automobile stopped, and one of the women from the automobile went to the house and got the housewife to sign. There was scarcely a house in Madison at the end of the campaign that did not display the food pledge card. Imagine on any type of modern program, a caravan of your neighbors in their cars driving up to your house and banging on your door and asking you to do something publicly that was a sacrifice of some sort. War Gardens was another way to participate. They brought squash and carrots and turnips and spinach and a panoply of other produce to the family table, easing some of the strains on commercial agriculture. Perhaps, however, the most important aspect of War Gardens and many other volunteer activities, however, was not what they produced, but it was the sense of participation in the war effort that gardeners felt when they grew their own food. In a society so totally committed to the war effort, gardens gave young and old a sense of belonging, of participating, of doing something to win the war. Industrial war production was also a part of the war effort, but it had mixed success in comparison to agriculture and volunteerism. American involvement in the war was so brief that many factories barely had time to convert to military production before the war was over. Across Wisconsin, factories made woolen cloth, rubber boots, heavy trucks, artillery. A.O. Smith in Milwaukee used its expertise making pressed steel car frames to become the nation's leading producer of bomb casings. And the DuPont plant in Washburn on Chequamegon Bay in Lake Superior became the world's leader in the production of TNT. Across Wisconsin, many companies participated in the war effort. As with World War II, the virtual entire industrial enterprise of the nation was in the process of converting to war. And a good example of this was in Green Bay. Alfred Lawson, former baseball player, expert promoter and huckster, and a visionary aviator, set out to create an aircraft company overnight. With the exception of small arms, however, the French and British supplied most of the machine guns, artillery, tanks, and aircraft used by the Americans. Lawson designed, or his engineers did, an airplane from scratch. It was originally called the MT-1. The Army wanted an aircraft, however, with a higher performance capacity. So Lawson's engineers developed a new aircraft called the MT-2 in its factory in Green Bay. The new aircraft was 12 miles an hour faster than the MT-1 and could reach a speed of 90 miles per hour. The Army was pleased. They placed an order for 100 planes, and then almost immediately thereafter canceled the order because the war was over. And therein lay the big conundrum for industrialists. If you made rifles, you made more rifles. If you made woolen clothing, you made it for the Army instead of for the civilian population. But if you were building something new, you had a hard time getting it to the military in time for the war. The French had a wonderful 77 millimeter gun. The United States Army spent so long trying to make it better that they never produced one. Wisconsin communities took great pride in all of the ways they supported the war effort. The purchase of war bonds offered another opportunity. And here too, we see both patriotism, but also social coercion at work. There were 5 Liberty loan drives during the war. The first 2 were only moderately successful. By the third, the United States had developed a pretty strong routine and knew what they were doing. They were going canvassing door to door, asking people to buy bonds. In the third drive, an army of volunteers canvassed the entire state. And imagine the picture. Maybe a Boy Scout or a neighbor came to your door, knocked on your door, and urged you to buy war bonds. Not only did they urge you to buy them, they had a little card in their hand, and it told them what the defense counsel thought you were capable of buying. If you said, well, no, I don't have that money, I can't buy that much in the way of bonds, the person at your door was instructed to point out that here's the information we have, and it says that you're able to buy more bonds than you purchased. If the person remained recalcitrant, imagine that Boy Scout or that neighbor saying, well, I'm sorry, but we'll have to turn this information over to the defense counsel when I get done for the day. This was coercion, plain and simple. And it's the dark side of patriotism in the United States during the war. Woodrow Wilson told a reporter just days before he asked Congress to declare war, quote, "Once lead this people to war and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless. In the spirit of ruthless brutality, brutality will enter the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, and the man in the street. If there is any alternative to war, for God's sake, let's take it." Wilson, of course, then took the nation into war, knowing better than most what the repercussions would be. And this plays out in many different situations during the war. The person who didn't buy a bond could find their home painted yellow. They could find a placard tacked to the mailbox saying, "A slacker lives here." These were threats to be taken seriously. Tales of being whisked off to Madison in the middle of the night, of disloyal citizens losing their jobs, and of terror tactics such as forced flag kissing rituals on the town square, all were very prevalent during the war. A citizen faced public ostracism as a slacker if they did not do as the community thought they were able. During the war, we also see this played out in politics. And I trace several different people during the war who were politicians. Bob LaFollette, Daniel Hohen, who's mayor of Milwaukee, and also Emanuel Phillips, the governor of Wisconsin. Emanuel Phillips is one of my favorite governors of all time because he had no tolerance at all for extra legal activities. One of the examples of extra legal activities occurred in Ashland during the war because it was a short distance from talking about imaginary traitors, which was common language amongst the Loyalty League, to real vigilantes. In many places, Americans imposed their own version of justice on neighbors they believed soft on the war effort. The most notable example in Wisconsin was the Loyal Knights of Liberty in Ashland. With excellent publicity, they seemed to be in league with the local newspaper. They tarred and feathered at least 4 disloyal neighbors. They had the seeming, the local citizens were so intimidated that state investigators sent by Governor Phillips were never able to make any headway in their investigation. Because of the super patriots who disliked Emmanuel Phillips, as far as they were concerned, he was soft on the Germans. Because of that, he ran for governor an extra term because the opponent that he was going to run against was a super patriot. And in every campaign speech, he would tell the audience at one point or another, there is nothing wrong with Wisconsin. Emmanuel Phillips believed in the loyalty and patriotism of the state's population. On one occasion, in his most strident denunciation of super patriots, Governor Phillips told an audience that the willingness to charge others with disloyalty, quote, is a type of impudence that is indulged in by a class of self-asserted patriots who are the greatest menace to the country today because they discourage what the country needs above all things during a crisis, and that is the hearty cooperation of all the people in support of the war. So as we look at the war, there are many lessons to be learned. One of the most prominent is just how dangerous it is when you have hate speech entering the political arena. And finally, I want to read to you the very last sentence of The Great War Comes to Wisconsin. It is in some ways the most important single sentence in the book. And it reads, perhaps the most important lesson of the Great War is the sobering reminder that when we engage in war, we undertake an enterprise over which we have little control, with potentially disastrous outcomes we cannot predict. The nations of Europe went to war in 1914, each one believing they could win. By the end of the war, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire were gone. And the French and British empires had begun their slow decline. Nobody would have anticipated that. Nobody anticipated a war that lasted so long and killed 20 million people. So the ultimate lesson is war is a dangerous thing, the outcome of which we cannot predict. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Hi, everybody. This is Kristen Gilpatrick, Marketing Manager for Wisconsin Historical Society Press. I see that Rick is getting some questions. Rick, if you can hear me,
Yeah.
we have one that was asking, was Governor Phillips reelected?
Yes.
He was, okay.
Well,
And
let me make two comments. The opponent that he was a stalwart Republican, and his opponent was another stalwart Republican, Roy Wilcox from Eau Claire, and so he won the primary, which in Wisconsin at that point in time, as a Republican, meant that you had won the general election also.
and then there was a question about Liberty Gardens and if they were a thing in World War I.
There were war gardens. They were not called Liberty Gardens or Victory Gardens at that time. That's a World War II name for them, but same basic principle, yes.
Okay, and it looks like Mitch has a question. If you had been Wisconsin governor at the time, what would you have done differently?
If I was governor at the time, it's hard pressed to get better than Emmanuel Phillips. He was a conservative Republican, but despite that, he had great faith in the people of Wisconsin. He had great faith in justice and in a country governed by law. And as a consequence, he had no patience whatsoever for the super patriots, and they returned the favor. At one point, actually, and let me see if I can find it. At one point, one of the primary super patriots, a guy by the name of Wheeler Bloodgood from Milwaukee, was making some very unusual pronouncements about the socialist mayor of Milwaukee. Daniel Hohen, the mayor, was a socialist all of his life, and he was mayor from 1916 to 1940. So you can gather that he did a pretty reasonable job. In fact, Milwaukee was one of the best governed cities in the country at that point. But what Bloodgood attempted to do, Bloodgood's conciliatory attitude did not last long. As chairman of the Milwaukee County Council of Defense, Bloodgood apparently concluded that Hohen was a traitor. When Hohen won the 1918 spring mayoral primary by a large margin, and his reelection in the fall seemed assured, Bloodgood began making threats that were not only ridiculous, but also treasonous in their own right. I will mention again, I think World War I has some interesting lessons for the present day. I assured Mayor Hohen, that is, this is Emmanuel Phillips talking, I assured Mayor Hohen that Bloodgood said this. I assured Mayor Hohen in the presence of many witnesses that I would have him indicted, and I assured him that he would never again be mayor of Milwaukee. I am seeking his indictment on the grounds of the socialist platform itself, to which Hohen subscribes. It declares that the people did not want war, that they did not want to, and that it was forced on them by the ruling classes. The ruling classes can mean only one thing in America: the president and Congress. That is sedition. Bloodgood not only wanted to see the mayor arrested, he had concluded that, quote, if the people of this country of this county are ready, as the primary votes would indicate, to stand with the socialists and abandon the honor of the nation and stab in the back the boys in France, then we should be treated as an enemy stronghold. Bloodgood went on to make the audacious threat that under no circumstances would Owen take office if reelected. In response to Bloodgood, Emanuel Phillips replied, "Whoever is elected mayor of Milwaukee will be inaugurated." The governor also declared, "Peace will rule in Wisconsin. Ku Klux Klan will rule in Wisconsin. No Ku Klux Klan will rule in Wisconsin, at least not for very long." There was another example where a county sheriff threatened to hang some poor soul who hadn't done something patriotic. Emanuel Phillips landed on him with both feet and informed the sheriff that under no circumstances were there going to be hangings, extrajudicial hangings in Wisconsin. So there is only actually one fault that I find with Emanuel Phillips. And it's an interesting one that I've seen nowhere but in the African American press, a newspaper in Madison. Emanuel Phillips apparently believed that African Americans should not have the vote because he did not believe that they were capable of learning enough to be reliable citizens. As should not come as any great surprise, the African American community in Wisconsin, and the newspaper, the press in Wisconsin, urged voters to vote for his opponent, Roy Wilcox, instead of Emanuel Phillips. I've never been able to understand quite how Phillips came to that conclusion, but it's the one thing that I dislike about him that I would certainly do differently.
Rick, we have just two other questions and just a few more minutes.
Okay.
Rose wants to know the name of the group in Ashland that was responsible for the tar and feathering incidents.
Is this Rose Havry?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Rose. The name is the Knights of Liberty, or something. Let me just look it up. I think there's an extra word that needs to be in there.
And while you're looking for source, Deb wants to know if there are any sources that detail what the people of Wisconsin of German background experienced during the war.
Oh, absolutely. I would turn to a couple of different things. In particular, the 6-volume history of Wisconsin, and it would be the volume 4. No, it's volume 5 by Paul Glad. Covers the wartime period and includes a very good chapter on the war and reflects upon the German population. My book does that as well. So those would be two sources that I would turn to. Robert Nesbitt's classic History of Wisconsin has good material. And then finally, I would go to the Wisconsin Magazine of History, which is online. It has excellent material on the wartime period. By the way, I'll mention one other thing. The Great War Comes to Wisconsin is an unusual book. And the reason I say that is there are very few state level histories of the war. World War I has largely been unheralded for many years. And you'll find a page or two in the county history, or you'll find a couple of pages in a state history. But it's very unusual to have an entire book focused on the state during the war. Of course, stopped looking for Knights of Liberty. Actually, if Rose is still on, why don't I email you the citations related to that chapter or to that episode. There are two basic sources. One is the Ashland Daily Press, which you have at the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center, but the other one is the governor's papers themselves. There's a really excellent clipping file, or actually it's not a clipping file. They transcribed the newspaper. It's pretty clear that the Ashland Daily Press, I think I've got the name right, was supportive of the Knights of I'm blanking completely. The Knights of Liberty. So why don't I email you the full name? Let's see, there's one other place I might have it. It's the Loyal Knights of Liberty is the full name. Kristen, any other questions?
Not that I see, Rick. Thank you so much. Wonderful
All right.
presentation.
All right. Take care.